The river's roar drowned out all other sounds as Samuel Irwin guided his horse along its swollen banks, the heavy spring rain having turned the usually peaceful waters into a raging torrent. It was 1878, and the unforgiving Wyoming territory had seen one of the wettest springs in memory. Samuel pulled his hat lower against the drizzle, his weathered face betraying little emotion despite the gnawing emptiness that had been his constant companion for the past 3 years, since returning from the war and losing his family to typhoid fever. That's when he saw it, something pale tumbling in the churning waters. Samuel squinted through the rain, his heart suddenly pounding when he realized it was a person being swept downstream. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse forward, following the river's edge until he reached a bend where the current slowed slightly. "Hold on!" He shouted uselessly against the roar of water as he dismounted, tethered his horse, and stripped off his heavy duster and gun belt. The person, a woman, he could now see, was barely keeping her head above water, her arms flailing as the current pulled her under again. Samuel plunged into the frigid river, the shock of cold stealing his breath as the current immediately tried to sweep his legs from under him. He was a strong swimmer, unusual for a cowboy thanks to summers spent in the creek near his childhood home in Tennessee. Fighting against the pull of the water, he managed to intercept the woman's path, grasping her arm just as she was about to go under again. "I've got you," he grunted, wrapping an arm around her waist and kicking hard toward the shore. The woman was limp in his arms, her sodden dress weighing them both down as he struggled against the current. His muscles screamed in protest, but he refused to let go, refused to let the river claim another life. With a final surge of strength, Samuel dragged them both onto the muddy bank, collapsing beside the unconscious woman. For a moment he simply lay there, gasping for breath, then rolled toward her still form. Her face was pale, lips tinged blue, and no breath seemed to move her chest. "No, madam, not today," Samuel muttered, turning her onto her side and firmly patting her back. When that yielded no response, he rolled her again and pressed on her chest, remembering how the doctor had revived a drowned boy back in Genoa last summer. After several agonizing moments, the woman convulsed suddenly, water spewing from her mouth as she coughed violently. Samuel quickly turned her onto her side again, supporting her as she expelled river water and gasped raggedly for air. When her breathing steadied somewhat, Samuel gathered her into his arms and carried her to his horse. He needed to get her warm and dry, and his cabin was a mile upriver. The woman's eyes fluttered open, briefly startling green eyes that locked with his for just a moment before closing again. "You're safe now, madam," Samuel said, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I'm taking you somewhere warm." The woman he'd pulled from the river remained unconscious as Samuel rode hard through the rain to his small cabin. By the time he kicked open the door, her skin was cold as ice, and he knew hypothermia was setting in. Working quickly, Samuel laid her on his bed and built up the fire in his small stone fireplace until it roared almost as loudly as the river had. Only then did he face the uncomfortable reality of what needed to be done. The woman's clothes were soaked through, and if he didn't get her dry and warm soon, she'd likely die despite his rescue. Samuel ran a hand through his dripping hair, conflicted. "Madam," he tried, gently shaking her shoulder. "Madam, can you hear me?" No response came from the pale woman on his bed. With a resigned sigh, Samuel retrieved a clean shirt and pair of trousers from his trunk, along with every blanket he owned. Then, as respectfully as possible, he removed her sodden outer garments, quickly covering her with blankets and leaving her undergarments in place. He hung her dress and petticoats near the fire to dry, then changed his own wet clothes. Once that uncomfortable task was complete, Samuel brewed a pot of strong coffee and sat in the room's only chair, watching over his unexpected guest. She was young, mid-20s perhaps, with hair the color of dark honey that was beginning to dry in loose waves around her face. Her features were delicate but strong, hinting at a determined character. What had brought her to be alone by a flooded river in such dangerous conditions? It was nearly midnight when she stirred, moaning softly before her eyes flickered open. For a moment she stared at the ceiling in confusion, then gasped, trying to sit up and immediately falling back with a groan. "Easy there," Samuel said, moving to her side with a cup of water. "You're safe. I pulled you from the river." The woman's green eyes fixed on him, wide with fear and confusion. "Where am I? Who are you?" named Samuel Irwin. "This is my cabin about 10 miles outside of Genoa. Found you being swept downstream in the Platte River." He offered the water again, and this time she took it with shaking hands. "Mind telling me your name and how you ended up in that river?" She sipped the water cautiously before answering. Rebecca Dawson." She closed her eyes briefly. The stage was crossing the river. The bridge collapsed. Everyone was screaming, then the water. Her voice broke. "The Holloway Bridge?" Samuel asked, alarmed. That bridge was the main crossing for the stage route to Cheyenne. If it had collapsed with a full stagecoach, Rebecca nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "There were 5 other passengers, the driver, the guard, did they?" But she could read the answer in Samuel's grim expression. "Oh God! I didn't see any sign of the stage or other passengers," Samuel said gently, "but I'll ride out at first light to check. The river's running hard. You were carried at least 2 miles from the bridge." He didn't add that the chances of finding other survivors were slim to none. Rebecca's composure crumbled, and she buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Samuel stood awkwardly by the bed, uncertain how to comfort this stranger. He'd spent so long avoiding human connections that he'd forgotten how to offer solace. "You should rest," he finally said. "You've been through a terrible ordeal. I'll check on the others tomorrow." Rebecca wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked up at him. "Thank you, Mr. Irwin, for saving my life." Samuel nodded stiffly. "Just did what anyone would do." "No," she said softly, "not everyone would have risked their life to save a stranger." Her words made him uncomfortable, and Samuel retreated to his chair, settling in for a night of keeping watch over his unexpected guest. As the rain continued to pound on the roof, he wondered what twist of fate had brought this woman to his isolated cabin, and why, after years of seeking solitude, he felt so unsettled by her presence. Morning came with clearing skies, though the river remained swollen and dangerous. Samuel had dozed fitfully in the chair, waking frequently to check on Rebecca, who had eventually fallen into an exhausted sleep. He rose quietly, added wood to the dying fire, and began preparing a simple breakfast of coffee, bacon, and biscuits from yesterday's batch. The smell of food roused Rebecca, who sat up slowly, wincing at what must have been considerable soreness from her ordeal. She gathered the blankets around herself, suddenly aware of her state of undress beneath Samuel's borrowed shirt. "Your clothes are mostly dry," Samuel said without looking at her, sensing her discomfort. "They're hanging by the fire. I'll step outside while you dress." "Thank you," Rebecca said quietly. Samuel nodded and took his coffee outside, giving her privacy. He leaned against the porch rail, surveying the landscape that had been his only companion for the past 3 years. His cabin sat on a rise overlooking a small valley, with the mountains rising in the distance. It was beautiful, peaceful, and utterly lonely, though he rarely admitted that to himself. The door creaked open behind him, and Rebecca stepped out, wearing her now dry dress though it was wrinkled and still showed water stains. Her honey-brown hair was pulled back in a simple knot, and in the morning light, Samuel could see faint freckles across her nose and cheeks. "I hope you don't mind that I made coffee," she said, offering him a tentative smile. "It's fine." Samuel gestured toward the door. "There's bacon, too, if you're hungry." They ate in awkward silence, Rebecca picking at her food while Samuel wolfed his down efficiently. When he finished, he pushed back from the table and reached for his hat. "I need to ride to the bridge, see if there are any other survivors," he said. "You should stay here and rest." Rebecca set down her fork. "I want to come with you," Samuel frowned. "It's not a good idea. The terrain is rough, and you're still recovering." "Those people were traveling with me," she said firmly. "I need to know what happened to them, and I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Irwin." Something in her tone, a quiet determination that brooked no argument, made Samuel reconsider. He recognized that same stubborn resilience that had kept him going after he'd lost everything. "It won't be pleasant," he warned. "Little in life is," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Samuel nodded once. "We leave in 10 minutes." They rode double on Samuel's gelding. Thunder, with Rebecca seated behind Samuel, her arms loosely around his waist. It had been years since Samuel had been in such close proximity to a woman, and he found himself uncomfortably aware of her presence, the light floral scent that somehow remained despite her river ordeal, the occasional brush of her hands against him as they navigated rough terrain. The scene at Holloway Bridge was as grim as Samuel had feared. The wooden structure had indeed collapsed, with only broken supports jutting from the churning water. Debris from the stagecoach was scattered along the riverbank, a wheel here, splintered wood there. A trunk burst open with soaked clothing fluttering in the breeze like surrender flags. And bodies. 3 of them, washed up along a bend in the river about a quarter-mile downstream. Samuel helped Rebecca dismount, then tied Thunder to a tree. "Stay here," he said, but she was already walking toward the grisly scene, her steps faltering but determined. The bodies were those of 2 men, likely the driver and guard, and an elderly woman. Their faces were blue-tinged and peaceful in death, the river having claimed them quickly. Samuel removed his hat in respect. "I knew her," Rebecca said softly, kneeling beside the elderly woman. "Mrs. Clarence. She was traveling to Cheyenne to meet her new grandchild." Her voice broke, but she composed herself with visible effort. "The others must still be in the river, or further downstream," Samuel said. "I'll alert the sheriff in Genoa. They'll organize a search party." He hesitated. "Were they family, the other passengers?" Rebecca shook her head. "Strangers. I was traveling to take a teaching position in Cheyenne." She brushed a strand of hair from Mrs. Clarence's forehead in a gesture of gentle respect. "What do we do now?" "We mark the location, then ride to Genoa to notify the authorities," Samuel said. "Nothing more we can do for them." They worked silently to move the bodies to higher ground, covering them with branches to protect them from scavengers, until a proper burial could be arranged. Samuel was impressed by Rebecca's composure. She worked alongside him without complaint, though he could see the toll it took in the tight lines around her mouth and the paleness of her face. By midday, they had done all they could and mounted Thunder again for the ride to Genoa. Rebecca was silent behind him, lost in her thoughts, and Samuel found himself wondering about the woman whose life he'd saved. A teacher, traveling alone to a new position, she must be brave and independent, qualities Samuel had always respected. "Did you lose everything in the river?" he asked over his shoulder as they rode. There was a pause before Rebecca answered. "Yes, my trunk was on top of the stage. All my possessions, my teaching credentials, the little money I had gone." Her voice was steady, but Samuel could hear the underlying despair. "The stage company will likely compensate you for your losses," he said, though he knew such compensation would be minimal and long in coming. Rebecca laughed softly, the sound holding no humor. "Perhaps, but the school term in Cheyenne starts in 2 weeks. Without proper credentials or appropriate clothing, I doubt the position will still be offered to me." Samuel had no answer for that. They rode in silence the rest of the way to Genoa, a small but growing town that served as a supply point for ranchers and a stopover on the stage route. The main street was muddy from the recent rains, and people stepped carefully from boardwalk to avoid the worst of it. Sheriff Tom Whitlock was in his office, feet propped on his desk, reading a newspaper. He looked up in surprise when Samuel entered, followed by Rebecca. "Sam Irwin," the sheriff said, standing. "Been, 6 months since I've seen you in town?" His curious gaze shifted to Rebecca. "This is Miss Rebecca Dawson," Samuel said. "She was the sole survivor of the Holloway Bridge collapse yesterday. Stage went into the river with all aboard." The sheriff's casual demeanor immediately shifted to professional concern. He took statements from both of them, dispatched riders to recover the bodies they'd found, and promised to organize a search for the missing passengers and the stage driver's family. "Miss Dawson, is there someone in town you can stay with while we sort this out?" Sheriff Whitlock asked when they'd finished. Rebecca shook her head. "I don't know anyone here. I was passing through on my way to Cheyenne." The sheriff scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Well, Mrs. Peterson at the boarding house might have a room, though with your belongings lost." He left the implication of payment hanging awkwardly in the air. "Miss Dawson can continue staying at my cabin until arrangements can be made," Samuel heard himself say, surprising both the sheriff and himself. "It's the least I can do." Sheriff Whitlock raised an eyebrow but nodded. "That's mighty generous, Sam. Miss Dawson, would that arrangement suit you?" Rebecca looked at Samuel, her expression a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "I wouldn't want to impose further on Mr. Irwin's kindness." "It's no imposition," Samuel said gruffly. "Cabin's got plenty of room, and it makes more sense than you staying in town with nothing but the clothes on your back." "Then I accept with gratitude," Rebecca said, a genuine smile briefly illuminating her face. After arranging for messages to be sent to the stage company and the school in Cheyenne about Rebecca's situation, they left the sheriff's office. Samuel led the way to the general store, where he purchased supplies and, after a whispered conversation with the shopkeeper's wife, some basic necessities for Rebecca. "You didn't have to do that," Rebecca protested when they left the store with their packages. "You need more than one dress," Samuel said simply, "and we don't know how long it will take to sort out your situation." Rebecca studied him for a moment. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Irwin? You've already saved my life. You owe me nothing further." Samuel secured their purchases to Thunder's saddle before answering. "I know what it's like to lose everything, Miss Dawson. No one should face that alone." Something in his tone must have discouraged further questions, for Rebecca merely nodded and allowed him to help her mount. As they rode back to his cabin, Samuel wondered at his own actions. 3 years of carefully cultivated solitude, broken by a woman tumbling down a river, what had possessed him to invite a stranger into his sanctuary? Yet as they rode in companionable silence, Samuel found himself oddly content with his decision. Perhaps it was simply the novelty of having someone to talk to after so long alone. Or perhaps it was something about Rebecca herself, her quiet strength, her dignity in the face of loss. Whatever the reason, he knew one thing for certain. His life had irrevocably changed the moment he'd spotted her in that raging river. Back at the cabin, Rebecca insisted on helping prepare their evening meal despite Samuel's protests that she should rest. "I've rested enough," she said firmly, rolling up her sleeves. "And I won't be a burden while I'm here." They worked side by side in the small kitchen area, Rebecca kneading dough for fresh biscuits while Samuel prepared a rabbit stew. It felt strangely domestic and strangely comfortable having someone share his space after so long alone. "You're quite self-sufficient, Mr. Irwin," Rebecca observed as she placed the biscuits in the Dutch oven. "Most bachelors I've known couldn't cook much beyond bacon and beans." Samuel stirred the stew, adding a pinch of the wild herbs he'd gathered last autumn. "Necessity teaches quickly. Been on my own since I was 16, except for my time in the war." "The war?" Rebecca looked up from her task. "You fought for the Union," Samuel nodded. "Joined up in '63 when I was 18. Served until the surrender at Appomattox." Rebecca wiped flour from her hands. "My father and older brother fought as well. My brother didn't come home." She said it matter-of-factly, but Samuel heard the old grief beneath the words. "I'm sorry," he said and meant it. "Too many good men lost." "Yes." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you have family, Mr. Irwin?" Samuel focused on the stew, stirring it more vigorously than necessary. "Not anymore." Something in his tone must have warned Rebecca not to press further, for she simply nodded and changed the subject. "Tell me about Genoa. It seems a pleasant little town." Grateful for the redirection, Samuel described the town and its inhabitants as they finished preparing the meal. By the time they sat down to eat, the awkwardness between them had lessened considerably. As dusk fell, Samuel faced the sleeping arrangements. "You take the bed again," he said. "I'll make a pallet by the fire." Rebecca frowned. "I've already displaced you from your bed for one night, Mr. Irwin. I can't in good conscience continue to do so." "It's no hardship," Samuel insisted. "I've slept in far worse places." "As have I," Rebecca countered, her chin lifting slightly. "Perhaps we could alternate. You take the bed tonight, and I'll sleep by the fire." Samuel shook his head, amused despite himself at her stubbornness. "Miss Dawson, I was raised to offer a lady the best available accommodations. My mother would rise from her grave to box my ears if I took the bed while you slept on the floor." At the mention of his mother, a shadow briefly crossed Samuel's face, and Rebecca's expression softened. "Then I thank you for your gentlemanly consideration, Mr. Irwin." That night, as Samuel lay on his pallet near the dying fire, listening to Rebecca's soft, even breathing from the bed, he realized how profoundly the silence of his cabin had changed. What had once been a comforting absence of demands and expectations now seemed merely empty. He turned onto his side, watching the embers glow in the darkness, and wondered what his life might have been if the war and subsequent illness hadn't taken everything from him. For the first time in years, Samuel fell asleep thinking not of the past, but of possibilities. The next week established a routine of sorts between Samuel and Rebecca. During the days, Samuel attended to his small herd of cattle and the maintenance of his property, while Rebecca took over the domestic tasks of the cabin with quiet efficiency. In the evenings, they shared meals and conversation that gradually grew more comfortable as they learned each other's habits and histories. Samuel discovered that Rebecca was the daughter of a lawyer from St. Louis, educated beyond what was common for women of her time. She had been teaching since she was 18, first in a small school in Missouri, then in increasingly remote locations as she sought adventure and independence. "My father wanted me to marry his law partner's son," she confided one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and pink. "A suitable match in every way, except that Henry was insufferably dull and expected a wife who would be content with needlepoint and gossip." Samuel smiled slightly, trying to imagine the determined woman beside him subjugated to such a life. "I take it you had other ideas." "I wanted to make a difference," Rebecca said simply. To teach children who might otherwise never learn to read or cipher, to see more of the world than St. Louis society, she sighed. My father didn't understand, but he respected my choice. We corresponded regularly until his death last year. I'm sorry, Samuel said, understanding all too well the pain of losing a parent. Rebecca nodded acknowledgement. And what of you, Mr. Irwin? You know much of my history, but you've shared little of yours. Samuel tensed, his instinct to deflect personal questions as he had for years. But something about the twilight and Rebecca's genuine interest made him hesitate. Not much to tell, he said finally. Grew up in Tennessee, went to war. Came west after. He paused, then added reluctantly, had a wife and son for a time. Rebecca remained silent, her eyes on the fading sunset, giving him space to continue or not as he chose. Emma was the daughter of our nearest neighbors, Samuel found himself saying, the words emerging as if from someone else. We married just before I enlisted. Thomas was born while I was at Gettysburg. He swallowed hard. Typhoid took them both in '75 along with my parents. 1 week and I had no family left. Samuel, Rebecca breathed, using his given name for the first time. I'm so sorry. He nodded stiffly, unable to look at her. Came west after that, figured there was nothing left for me back there. Rebecca's hand covered his where it rested on the porch rail, a gentle touch that somehow anchored him in the present, rather than dragging him back into painful memories. Thank you for telling me, she said softly. I know it wasn't easy. They sat in silence as darkness fell completely, Rebecca's hand still resting lightly on his, a connection that Samuel found himself unwilling to break. On the 10th day after Rebecca's arrival, a rider from town brought news. The stage company had confirmed the deaths of all passengers, except Rebecca, and had sent formal condolences along with a small sum for her lost belongings. More significantly, the school board in Cheyenne had decided they could not hold the position for her without proper credentials, and had hired another teacher. Rebecca received the news with a composure that Samuel had come to respect, though he could see the disappointment in her eyes. Well, she said after the rider had departed, it seems I need to make new plans. What will you do? Samuel asked, watching her carefully fold the letters and place them on the table. Rebecca squared her shoulders. Find another teaching position, I suppose. Perhaps in Genoa itself or another nearby town. And in the meantime, Samuel tried to keep his tone casual, though he was suddenly anxious about her answer. Rebecca met his gaze directly. In the meantime, Mr. Irwin, I find myself without funds or lodging. I don't suppose you would consider allowing me to remain here a bit longer. I would, of course, continue to contribute to the household and could perhaps offer reading lessons to neighbors' children for a small fee to offset my keep. Samuel felt an inexplicable relief at her request. You're welcome to stay as long as needed, Miss Dawson, and there's no need for payment. Rebecca smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face and made something in Samuel's chest tighten. Thank you, and please, after all we've been through, I think you might call me Rebecca. Rebecca, Samuel echoed, finding he liked the way her name felt on his tongue. And I'm Samuel, not Mr. Irwin. Samuel, she repeated softly, and somehow the simple exchange of names felt more intimate than any conversation they'd yet shared. The following Sunday, they rode into Genoa for church services. Samuel wearing his rarely used goods shirt and Rebecca in one of the 2 dresses purchased at the general store. Their arrival together caused a ripple of interest among the townsfolk, many of whom had heard the story of the river rescue but were seeing Rebecca for the first time. After the service, they were approached by Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, the formidable widow who served as president of the town's Ladies' Aid Society and unofficial arbiter of social standards. "Mr. Irwin," she said with a nod to Samuel, before turning her full attention to Rebecca. "And you must be Miss Dawson. We've all heard of your terrible ordeal. How fortunate that Mr. Irwin was there to save you." "Yes, I've been very blessed by his kindness," Rebecca replied with a polite smile. Mrs. Jenkins's gaze flickered between them, assessment clear in her shrewd eyes. "And you're staying at Mr. Irwin's cabin, I understand." The question carried unmistakable disapproval, and Samuel stiffened, preparing to defend their arrangement, but Rebecca spoke first. "Yes, Mr. Irwin has graciously provided shelter while I recover and make new arrangements, as I lost all my possessions in the accident." Her tone was pleasant but firm. "I'm hoping to secure a teaching position in the area, perhaps even here in Genoa." Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Indeed." "Well, as it happens, our schoolteacher, Miss Baxter, has just announced her engagement to Mr. Peterson, the blacksmith. She'll be leaving her position at the end of the month." She studied Rebecca more carefully now. "Do you have experience?" "5 years teaching in Missouri and Kansas," Rebecca said, "though I must admit my credentials were lost in the river." "I can attest to her education and capability," Samuel found himself saying. "Miss Dawson is well versed in literature, mathematics, and history. The children of Genoa would be fortunate to learn from her." Both women looked at him with surprise, Mrs. Jenkins because Samuel rarely spoke at such length to anyone, and Rebecca because of his unequivocal endorsement. "Well," Mrs. Jenkins said after a moment, "the school board meets this Tuesday. Perhaps you should present yourself to them, Miss Dawson. I shall mention your interest to my husband, who serves as chairman." "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. I would be most grateful," Rebecca said sincerely. As they rode back to the cabin after an impromptu dinner invitation from Sheriff Whitlock and his wife, Rebecca was quiet, seemingly deep in thought. "Something troubling you?" Samuel asked as they crested the hill overlooking his property. Rebecca sighed. "I'm concerned about appearances, Samuel." Mrs. Jenkins was not subtle in her disapproval of our living arrangement. Samuel frowned. "I hadn't considered that. Out here, people tend to mind their own business. In small towns, everything is everyone's business," Rebecca said ruefully. "If I hope to secure the teaching position in Genoa, I must be above reproach. Teachers are held to the highest moral standards." "You could stay with the sheriff's wife," Samuel suggested, though the thought of his cabin without Rebecca's presence was surprisingly disheartening. Rebecca nodded slowly. "Perhaps that would be best, at least until I know whether the position might be mine." She paused. "Though I must admit I've grown accustomed to our little cabin. Our little cabin." The phrase warmed Samuel in a way he hadn't experienced in years. "As have I," he admitted quietly. The following day, Samuel rode with Rebecca into town, where Sarah Whitlock welcomed her warmly into her home. The sheriff's wife was a kindly woman in her 40s who had taken an immediate liking to Rebecca at their Sunday dinner. "It's only proper," Sarah said as she showed Rebecca to the spare bedroom. "A young, unmarried woman needs the protection of a respectable household, especially when seeking a position of influence like teaching." Rebecca thanked her graciously, though Samuel could see she chafed at the constraints of social convention. He himself felt oddly bereft as he rode back to his cabin alone, the space seeming larger and emptier than it had before Rebecca's arrival. Tuesday came, and with it, Rebecca's interview with the Genoa School Board. Samuel found himself unable to focus on his work, wondering how she was faring. By mid-afternoon, his curiosity got the better of him, and he rode into town, ostensibly to purchase supplies but really hoping for news. He found Rebecca exiting the town hall, her expression a mix of excitement and disbelief. When she spotted him tethering Thunder outside the general store, her face lit up with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. "Samuel," she called, hurrying toward him. "I was just coming to find you." "How did it go?" he asked, unable to keep the eagerness from his voice. "They offered me the position," Rebecca said, her green eyes sparkling. "Beginning next month, I'll be the new teacher for Genoa." She laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Mr. Jenkins was impressed by my knowledge of algebra, of all things. Apparently the previous teacher struggled with mathematics." "Congratulations," Samuel said, genuinely pleased for her. "They've made a wise choice." Rebecca impulsively caught his hands in hers. "I couldn't have done it without you, Samuel. Your support and belief in me. It means more than I can say." Samuel was acutely aware of her warm hands holding his, of the admiring glances from passers-by, of the way Rebecca's happiness seemed to illuminate her from within. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, a long, dormant hope that perhaps his life hadn't ended with Emma and Thomas after all. The thought both exhilarated and terrified him. The next 2 weeks passed quickly as Rebecca prepared to assume her teaching duties. She remained with the Whitlocks, though she visited Samuel's cabin several times to help tend the vegetable garden they had started together, and to share news of her preparations. Samuel found himself looking forward to these visits with an intensity that should have worried him, but somehow didn't. Something was changing between them, a comfortable companionship, deepening into something more significant. He caught Rebecca watching him sometimes with a softness in her eyes that made his pulse quicken, and he found himself making excuses to be near her, to hear her laugh, to see her face light up when she spoke of her plans for the school. On a warm evening in late May, a month after Samuel had pulled Rebecca from the river, they sat together on the porch of his cabin after spending the day planting corn in the garden plot. "The school board has offered me lodging in the rooms above the schoolhouse," Rebecca said, watching the fireflies begin to emerge in the gathering dusk. "I'll move in next weekend before classes start on Monday." "That's good," Samuel said, ignoring the hollow feeling in his chest at the thought of Rebecca settled permanently in town, away from the cabin where he'd grown so accustomed to her presence. "Proper for the teacher to have her own place." Rebecca nodded, then turned to look at him directly. "Samuel, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." The serious note in her voice made him tense. "What is it?" "The Whitlocks are hosting a dance this Saturday to welcome me as the new teacher. Would you consider attending? With me?" Her cheeks colored slightly, but her gaze remained steady. Samuel hadn't attended a social function since before Emma's death. The thought of making small talk with townsfolk while navigating the unfamiliar territory of accompanying Rebecca to a dance made his palms sweat. "I don't dance much," he said awkwardly. "Nor do I these days," Rebecca admitted with a small smile, "but I would very much like your company." Something in her expression, hopeful yet hesitant, made it impossible for Samuel to refuse. "Then I'd be honored to escort you, Rebecca." Her smile was worth every moment of discomfort he anticipated. Saturday evening found Samuel standing on the Whitlock's porch, freshly shaved and wearing his best suit, which felt tight across the shoulders after so long unworn. He knocked, heart pounding ridiculously as if he were a boy calling on his first sweetheart rather than a grown man of 33. Sarah Whitlock answered the door with a knowing smile. "My goodness, Sam Irwin, you clean up nicely," she teased, ushering him inside. "Rebecca will be down in a moment." Samuel stood awkwardly in the parlor, hat in hand, until a soft footstep on the stairs made him turn. His breath caught in his throat. Rebecca descended the staircase in a dress of deep blue that brought out the green of her eyes and the golden highlights in her hair, which was arranged in an elegant knot with soft tendrils framing her face. She wore no jewelry except for small pearl earrings, but her natural beauty needed no adornment. "You look." Samuel struggled to find appropriate words. Beautiful seemed inadequate, but his limited experience with complimenting women left him at a loss. Rebecca's smile was radiant as she reached the bottom of the stairs. "Thank you," she said, as if he had offered the most eloquent praise. "You look very handsome yourself." Samuel offered his arm, and together they walked the short distance to the town hall, which had been transformed for the occasion with lanterns, bunting, and wildflowers. It seemed the entire population of Genoa had turned out for the event, curious to meet their new teacher, and perhaps even more curious to see the reclusive Irwin escorting her. The evening progressed better than Samuel had dared hope. Rebecca was warmly welcomed by the townspeople, and her natural charm and intelligence quickly won over even the most skeptical parents. Samuel found himself drawn into conversations about cattle breeding with local ranchers, and to his surprise, enjoying the social interaction he had avoided for so long. When the band struck up a waltz, Rebecca turned to him with raised eyebrows. "Shall we?" she asked. Samuel hesitated only briefly before leading her onto the dance floor. "I warned you I'm out of practice," he murmured as he awkwardly placed his hand at her waist. "We'll manage together," Rebecca said softly, and somehow they did, finding a rhythm that carried them smoothly around the floor. Samuel gradually relaxed, becoming aware of the delicate pressure of Rebecca's hand in his, the subtle scent of lavender that clung to her hair, the way her eyes never left his as they moved in perfect harmony. It was during their second dance, a slower piece that required them to stand closer together, that Samuel realized with sudden clarity that he was falling in love with Rebecca Dawson. The knowledge should have terrified him, but instead, it felt like coming home after a long, cold journey. "What are you thinking?" Rebecca asked, noticing his expression change. "You look as if you've just made a momentous discovery." Samuel smiled, a real smile that felt unfamiliar on his face but right in this moment. "Perhaps I have," he said, unable to elaborate further but knowing that something fundamental had shifted within him. The evening continued with more dancing, refreshments, and conversation. As the hour grew late, Samuel noticed Rebecca stifling a yawn, ready to head back. He asked, and she nodded gratefully. They walked slowly through the quiet streets of Genoa, Rebecca's hand tucked into the crook of Samuel's arm. The night was clear, stars scattered across the Wyoming sky like diamonds on black velvet. "I've always loved the stars out here," Rebecca said, looking up. "In St. Louis, the city lights dimmed them considerably." "One of the reasons I chose this place," Samuel admitted. "The sky feels endless." They reached the Whitlocks' house all too soon. On the porch, Rebecca turned to face Samuel, her expression earnest in the soft glow from the window. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "It meant a great deal to have you there." Samuel took a deep breath. "Rebecca, he faltered, unused to expressing his feelings and unsure how to proceed. Rebecca waited, her eyes gentle and patient. "I've grown accustomed to your company," he finally managed. "These past weeks, you've brought something back to my life that I thought was gone forever." Rebecca's breath caught audibly. "What's that?" "Hope," Samuel said simply. "A reason to look forward to tomorrow." Rebecca's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Oh, Samuel," she whispered, "you've done the same for me. When I went into that river, I lost everything I thought mattered, my possessions, my position, my plans. But in saving me, you gave me something far more valuable." "What's that?" Samuel echoed her earlier question. A chance to discover what truly matters, Rebecca said. Not credentials or positions, but connections, people, you. The last word hung between them, laden with meaning. Samuel found himself leaning forward slowly, giving Rebecca every chance to withdraw if he had misread the situation. But she moved toward him with equal intent, and their lips met in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deepening with shared longing. When they finally parted, Samuel rested his forehead against Rebecca's, unwilling to create more distance between them. "I thought I would spend the rest of my life alone," he confessed. "I didn't want to risk caring for anyone again, not after losing Emma and Thomas." Rebecca's hand came up to cup his cheek. "I understand, Samuel. Loss changes us, but perhaps it can also open us to new possibilities if we're brave enough to embrace them." "I want to be brave enough," Samuel said. "For you." Rebecca smiled, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Then we'll be brave together." With a final, tender kiss goodnight, Samuel reluctantly took his leave, riding back to his cabin with his mind and heart full of Rebecca. The solitude he had once cherished now seemed hollow in comparison to the richness of sharing his life with someone who understood him, someone who saw past his defenses to the man he truly was. For the first time since he had lost his family, Samuel Irwin allowed himself to imagine a future that included love, companionship, perhaps even a family again someday. And the thought, rather than bringing pain, filled him with a quiet joy that sustained him through the night. The following week brought significant changes for both Samuel and Rebecca. She began her teaching duties, quickly winning the affection and respect of her students with her combination of high expectations and genuine care for their progress. Samuel found himself riding into town more frequently, ostensibly on business but really to catch glimpses of Rebecca at work, or to escort her on evening walks. Their courtship for that was what it had become progressed with a careful tenderness, both of them aware of the wounds they carried and the hope they were nurturing. They spoke openly of their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Rebecca shared stories of her childhood in St. Louis, of her brother's death in the war and her father's slow decline thereafter. Samuel gradually revealed more about Emma and Thomas, finding that speaking of them with Rebecca somehow honored their memory rather than betraying it. On a Sunday afternoon in early June, they rode to Samuel's cabin after church services, planning to enjoy the picnic lunch Rebecca had prepared. As they approached the property, Samuel reined in thunder, surveying the familiar landscape with new eyes. "I've been thinking," he said as Rebecca waited expectantly behind him on the horse. "This place is too far from town for you to travel back and forth each day for teaching." Rebecca nodded, though she looked puzzled at the observation. "Yes, it would be a difficult journey, especially in winter." Samuel turned slightly to see her face. "But what if it wasn't just my cabin anymore? What if it was our home?" Rebecca's eyes widened as she grasped his meaning. "Samuel, are you?" He guided Thunder to a flat rock near the cabin entrance and dismounted, then helped Rebecca down, keeping hold of her hands as he faced her. "I'm not eloquent with words," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I know what I want, and that's a life with you, Rebecca. You pulled me from a darkness I didn't even know I was lost in. You gave me reason to hope again, to love again." He took a deep breath. "Will you marry me?" Tears spilled over Rebecca's lashes as she nodded, too overwhelmed for words at first. Then she threw her arms around Samuel's neck, pressing her face against his shoulder. "Yes," she whispered against his ear. "Yes, Samuel, I'll marry you." Samuel held her tightly, a joy he had thought never to feel again expanding in his chest until he thought it might burst. When they finally pulled apart, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I hope it fits," he said, opening the pouch to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl. It was my mother's. Rebecca gasped softly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "It's perfect," she said, admiring how it caught the sunlight. "Absolutely perfect." They spent the afternoon planning their future together, a summer wedding, improvements to the cabin to make it more suitable for a family, arrangements for Rebecca to continue teaching at least through the next school year. "We'll need to add rooms eventually," Samuel said as they walked the property, his arm around Rebecca's waist. "For children." Rebecca looked up at him, her expression tender. "You want more children?" Samuel nodded slowly. "I think I do with you," he hesitated. "Does that thought please you?" "Very much," Rebecca said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I've always wanted children of my own to teach and nurture." They announced their engagement at church the following Sunday, to general approval and some knowing smiles from those who had observed their growing attachment. Mrs. Jenkins immediately took charge of wedding preparations, declaring that the new teacher must have a ceremony befitting her position in the community. In the weeks that followed, Samuel watched with amusement and a touch of bewilderment as his simple life was transformed by wedding plans and cabin renovations. Rebecca insisted on being involved in the latter, demonstrating a practical knowledge of construction that surprised and impressed Samuel. "My father believed girls should understand how things work as well as boys," she explained as she helped him frame a new bedroom addition. "He taught me to use tools when I was barely tall enough to reach his workbench." By mid-July, the cabin had expanded to include a proper bedroom and a small study where Rebecca could prepare her lessons and grade her students' work. Samuel had cleared more land for an expanded garden, and together they planted fruit trees that would bear in years to come, a tangible investment in their shared future. On the first Saturday in August 1878, with summer flowers in full bloom and the mountains providing a majestic backdrop, Samuel Irwin and Rebecca Dawson were married in the Genoa church. The entire town turned out for the occasion, the schoolchildren forming an honor guard that showered the couple with flower petals as they emerged as husband and wife. The celebration continued at the town hall, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed twice the population of Genoa. Samuel, uncomfortable with being the center of attention but unwilling to deny Rebecca the celebration she deserved, endured the good-natured teasing of his neighbors and the endless handshakes and congratulations with better grace than anyone expected. As evening approached, the couple prepared to depart for their wedding night at their newly renovated cabin. Sheriff Whitlock pulled Samuel aside for a moment, clapping him on the shoulder. "Never thought I'd see the day," the sheriff said with a grin. The most confirmed bachelor in the territory, brought to heel by a schoolteacher. Samuel glanced across the room at Rebecca, who was accepting a final embrace from Sarah Whitlock. "Not brought to heel, Tom," he corrected quietly. "Brought back to life." The sheriff's expression sobered. "I'm happy for you, Sam, truly. After what you've been through, you deserve this happiness." "I don't know about deserving," Samuel said thoughtfully, "but I'm grateful for it, and I intend to treasure it every day." Their departure was marked by cheers, well wishes, and a few ribald comments that made Rebecca blush but laugh good-naturedly. As they rode toward home, their home now, truly the setting sun painted the landscape in gold and amber, a fitting close to a perfect day. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered each other with tender passion, their union as natural and right as if they had been created for one another. In Rebecca's arms, Samuel found a healing he had not known he still needed, and in Samuel's embrace, Rebecca found the belonging she had sought all her life. Afterward, lying together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Rebecca traced the lines of Samuel's face with gentle fingers. Do you remember what you said that day you proposed? That I pulled you from darkness, Samuel nodded, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. It was true. I've been thinking about it, Rebecca continued softly. How strange and wonderful that we should both have been saved by the river. You pulled me from the water, but in doing so, you were also pulled from the isolation that was drowning you just as surely as the current was drowning me. Samuel considered this, struck by the truth of her observation. Maybe that's how healing works, he said after a moment. We save each other, even when we think we're only saving ourselves. Rebecca smiled in the darkness, settling her head against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. I like that thought. That we're not meant to rescue ourselves alone, but to reach out to one another. Samuel tightened his arm around her, profoundly grateful for the twist of fate that had brought this remarkable woman into his life. I love you, Rebecca Irwin, he said, still marveling at the new name that made her his wife. And I love you, Samuel Irwin, she replied, her voice soft with contentment. Now and always. As they drifted toward sleep, Samuel realized that the emptiness that had been his constant companion for so long was gone, replaced by a fullness of heart he had never expected to feel again. The cabin that had once been his refuge from pain had transformed into a home filled with love and possibility. And the future, which had once stretched before him bleak and solitary, now promised joy, purpose, and connection. The year that followed their marriage brought changes both expected and surprising. Rebecca continued teaching, earning the respect of even the most difficult parents with her dedication and skill. Samuel expanded his cattle operation, using innovative breeding techniques that increased both the size and quality of his herd. Together, they established themselves as a well-regarded couple in the growing community of Genoa. In the spring of 1879, Rebecca shared the news Samuel had been both hoping for and fearing. She was expecting their first child, due in late autumn. His initial reaction combined joy with paralyzing terror, memories of losing Thomas threatening to overwhelm him. Rebecca, understanding his fear without him having to voice it, took his hands in hers. "This child is not Thomas," she said gently but firmly. "And I am not Emma. We cannot live our lives afraid of history repeating itself, Samuel." "I know," Samuel acknowledged, pulling her close. "But knowing doesn't always quiet the fear." "Then we'll face it together," Rebecca said, her steady presence anchoring him as it had so many times before. Day by day, step by step. As Rebecca's pregnancy progressed, Samuel found his anxiety gradually giving way to anticipation. He built a cradle from pine harvested on their property, carving intricate designs of mountains and rivers into the headboard. Rebecca sewed tiny garments in the evenings, her expression serene as she worked. On a crisp November morning, after a night of labor during which Samuel had never felt more helpless or more in awe of his wife's strength, their son was born. They named him William Robert Irwin, William for Rebecca's father, Robert for Samuel's. Holding his newborn son, Samuel experienced a complex mixture of emotions: overwhelming love, residual fear, profound gratitude. Rebecca watched them from the bed, exhausted but radiant. "He has your eyes," she said softly. Samuel examined the tiny face. "And your determination. Did you see how he fought against the swaddling?" Rebecca laughed, the sound filling their bedroom with joy. "He'll be a handful, I suspect." "We'll manage," Samuel said, carefully placing the baby in Rebecca's arms before sitting beside her on the bed. Together. As young William grew, so did the Irwin family's standing in the community. Samuel was elected to the town council, his practical approach to problem-solving and fiscal responsibility earning him respect even from those who had once considered him a recluse. Rebecca, while taking a brief hiatus from teaching after William's birth, established a reading circle for adults in the community who had never had the opportunity to learn. By the time William was 2, the cabin had expanded again to include a larger kitchen and a dedicated schoolroom where Rebecca could tutor students who needed extra help. The property now boasted a thriving orchard, expanded vegetable gardens, and a small but productive beehive that produced honey sweet enough to win ribbons at the county fair. In the summer of 1882, their family grew again with the arrival of a daughter, Catherine Emma Irwin. Kathy, as she was immediately nicknamed, inherited her mother's honey-brown hair and her father's quiet intensity. William, now an energetic 3-year-old, alternated between fascination with his baby sister and jealousy of the attention she received. Life settled into a rhythm of work and family, challenges and celebrations. There were difficult times, a harsh winter that threatened their cattle herd, a scarlet fever outbreak in the school that kept Rebecca awake for nights on end caring for sick children, financial strains when cattle prices temporarily collapsed. But through it all, Samuel and Rebecca faced each challenge as they had promised on their wedding night together, drawing strength from each other and from the love that had grown deeper with each passing year. On a golden autumn afternoon in 1888, 10 years after Samuel had pulled Rebecca from the river, they sat on the porch of their now substantial home, watching William practice roping techniques while 6-year-old Kathy collected colorful leaves nearby. The property had expanded to include a proper barn, bunkhouse for the 2 ranch hands Samuel now employed, and a small guest cottage where Rebecca's visiting colleagues occasionally stayed. I received a letter from Mrs. Peterson today, Rebecca said, her hand finding Samuel's as it often did when they sat together. She and her husband are returning from Denver next month. She asked if I would consider taking back my teaching position, as her replacement hasn't worked out. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Are you considering it? Rebecca tilted her head thoughtfully. I miss it sometimes, the classroom, but our home school for the children keeps me busy enough and the adult reading program is growing. She squeezed his hand. What do you think? Samuel studied her face, still beautiful to him after all these years, though now showing fine lines around her eyes and mouth lines earned through laughter and occasional tears, through the full life they had built together. I think you should do whatever brings you joy, he said simply. We can manage the household and the children, especially now that William is old enough to take on more responsibility. Rebecca smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. Remember how frightened you were to open your heart again, how determined you were to remain alone. Samuel chuckled, the memory no longer painful. I was a stubborn fool. No, Rebecca said softly. You were a man who had lost everything and was afraid to risk losing more. But you were brave enough to try again, to pull me from that river even though you knew saving me might mean disrupting the safe, solitary life you'd built. Best disruption that ever happened to me, Samuel said, turning to kiss her forehead. Though I seem to recall you doing most of the saving. Rebecca laughed, the sound carrying across the yard and causing both children to look up and smile at their parents. I suppose we saved each other, just as we said that night after our wedding. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the desperate, lonely man who had plunged into a raging river to save a stranger, to the husband, father, and community leader he had become, the transformation seemed almost miraculous. Yet it had happened gradually, day by day, choice by choice, each small act of courage and love building upon the last until the man he had been was almost unrecognizable to him now. What are you thinking? Rebecca asked, noting his pensive expression. Samuel smiled, watching as William successfully roped a practice dummy, turning to them with a triumphant grin while Kathy applauded her brother's skill. "I was thinking how fortunate I am," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "How one moment one choice to ride along that river on that particular rainy day changed everything." Rebecca nodded, understanding as she always did. "Some might call it fate or divine intervention." "And what would you call it?" Samuel asked, curious about her perspective. Rebecca considered the question seriously before answering. "I think perhaps it was love, finding a way to exist even before we knew to look for it." Samuel pondered this, finding wisdom in her words as he so often did. "Well, whatever brought us together, I'm grateful for it every day." As twilight deepened, Samuel called the children in for supper. They came running, William helping his sister over a fallen log, their laughter filling the air with a music Samuel once thought he would never hear again. That night, as they prepared for bed in the room that had been theirs for a decade now, Rebecca paused before the small mirror, removing the pins from her hair. "I was thinking of inviting the new families who moved in near Granite Creek to our harvest celebration," she said, meeting Samuel's eyes in the reflection. "The children could use some playmates their age, and the adults seemed a bit lost at church on Sunday." Samuel nodded, recognizing in her suggestion the same compassion that had always guided her actions. "That's a fine idea. I noticed the husband seemed to keep to himself, didn't say much." Rebecca smiled knowingly. "Reminds me of someone I met about 10 years ago." Samuel chuckled, coming to stand behind her and placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "Then perhaps what he needs is someone to pull him from his isolation, as you did for me." "Perhaps," Rebecca agreed, leaning back against him, "though I suspect his wife is already working on that. I saw how she watches him with love and patience." "A powerful combination," Samuel murmured, pressing a kiss to the curve where her neck met her shoulder. Rebecca turned in his arms, her green eyes as captivating to him now as they had been the first time he saw them. "The most powerful," she agreed, reaching up to touch his face with tender familiarity. "Thank you for pulling me from the river that day, Samuel Irwin." Samuel drew her closer, the gratitude in his heart too profound for words. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you for pulling me from the depths of my loneliness, Rebecca Irwin." And as they held each other in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, in the home they had built together, both physically and emotionally, Samuel knew with absolute certainty that some rescues continued long after the initial moment of salvation that love, once sparked, could keep saving you every day for the rest of your life. Outside, the river that had once nearly claimed Rebecca's life flowed peacefully under a star-filled sky, its waters now a source of life and sustenance for their land rather than a place of danger. Like the river, their lives had found a natural course, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, but always moving forward together, carrying them toward whatever adventures and challenges still awaited in the years to come.